Solo Leveling Season 2 Episode 6 was easily the best looking episode from this season and one of the best looking episodes across the entire show. It was an action spectacle filled with eye-catching animation highlights. Let's break down the visuals. As always, make sure to subscribe. This episode was directed and storyboarded by the one and only Takayuki Kikuchi. Kikuchi, for those of you who don't know, directed and storyboarded episode 11 from the previous season, and that was one of the best action episodes I've seen in a minute. It was phenomenal. It wasn't just the cool looking cuts, the flow, the overall structure of the action, the choreography. It was about as close to perfect as the 11th episode of a seasonal modern action anime can be. Some directors just get it, you know? They have a knack for action direction, and Kikuchi, in my opinion, is one such director. Naturally, I was really looking forward to his work in this episode, and I'm glad to report it did not disappoint. I think we can safely assume that this was the episode, or in other words, it was high up on the priority list for the team. Again, that's just an assumption, but come on, just look at it. They gathered the entire squad for this episode. We had the aforementioned Takayuki Kikuchi, who in my opinion is the best action storyboard artist from the team. We had Yoshihiro Kano, the main action guy behind Solo Leveling. He is the main action animator / animation director for this series. We had Takafumi Tori, yet another fantastic action animator. He also doubled down as the action animation director for this episode. We had Hajime Nakagawa, the guy with the unique art style, and many more. Long story short, this was a stacked episode, and naturally it looked incredible. Now, before we go through this thing scene by scene, let's address a few general things. Just like Kikuchi's episode 11, this episode featured a grand volumetric 3D space. The throne room was one big CGI background model, just like that other throne room. And that's a good thing because Kikuchi is excellent at using 3D spaces to craft a grand volumetric action scene. His action storyboards are three-dimensional and they make fantastic use of 3D background components. And speaking of CGI, this episode used plenty of 3D models, which is understandable. Not only is animating all of these orcs by hand very difficult, it's unnecessary. Yes, season 1 for the most part featured 2D monsters, but as the scale and the scope of the story increases, the use of 3D becomes more justified. The models themselves looked fine. They weren't exactly the pinnacle of anime CGI, but they were far from bad. The ultra-wide shots with multiple CGI characters fighting looked solid, and while yes, a couple of CG heavy mid shots did look iffy, the overall CGI model use was solid. More about the behind the scenes circumstances, I'm sure things were smoother this time around compared to the previous episodes, but at the same time, I highly doubt things were smooth. The deadlines were probably more lenient by virtue of this being a high priority undertaking, but the staff list was messy, animation directors and second key animators galore, and I think we are past the point where a Solo Leveling episode is produced smoothly. It's not about smooth and rough productions at this point, it's about very rough productions and somewhat less rough productions. Again, everything I said is speculative, but it's not hard to believe, is it? Anyway, that's enough rambling, let's go through this episode. The opening segment featured a couple of cool ultra-wide shots and this fun high-angle perspective on a pickaxe of all things. Although I think the best thing to do would be to focus on the action. The first bit of which looked really cool. They kicked things off with these really well-drawn close-ups. I loved how extra the shading was. The faces looked expressive and they were moving. Looped movement, yes, but movement nonetheless. Also a cool animated zoom out here, although it is slightly choppy. I loved this cut. Shots like these are extremely difficult to execute. They are highly prone to melting. Maintaining volume and line consistency despite the tiny minuscule amount of change between frames is commendable. There are so many areas where this shot could have fallen apart. The keyframes could have been inconsistent, the cleanup could have been poor, the in-between animation could have fallen apart, but somehow every single department involved did their part. Also loved the depth of field blur. It adds more volume. This shot and the shot that followed were animated on once and naturally they looked smooth. The wind effects in this cut were satisfying to look at and the ground had these flickering speed lines which conveyed, well, speed. This shot was wonderfully dynamic. The storyboards used the 3D space to wrap the camera around him, followed by this exaggerated foreshortened perspective. The animated zoom into his eye was done on ones, and it looked so good. Something being animated on ones, in case you didn't know, means the frame rate is 24, or that a unique drawing is used for a single frame. This landing made heavy use of blurring. He was completely blurred when he landed and came into focus as he slid towards the camera, which again conveys depth and volume. More dynamic CGI-aided shots followed. The throne is 3D here, so is the floor, and that allows the hypothetical camera to move around. You know how these work, you've seen early Attack on Titan. These relatively unimportant smoke clouds looked really good for some reason. They are blurred, but you can see the large amount of detail in these shapes. This cut featured these presumably digital speed lines which conveyed intensity, and this shot looked really cool, despite not doing much in terms of 2D animation thanks to the 3D background. A mandatory Sung looks really cool shot here. I think they are contractually obligated to include at least 15 of those every episode. Also worth noting, the smoke in the background is actually moving, despite the fact that it's neither in focus nor is it the focus. Amazing close-up here, the blacked out sections looked great. This episode featured plenty of well-drawn monsters. Don't let the CGI distract you from that fact. Some cool looking effects and a small but decent bit of character acting then brought us to the main fight. Sung's shadows have these compositing filters added onto certain areas of their bodies, and they make the screen look a tad bit too busy, but it's not a big deal. You might look at a shot like this and go, oh, it was probably easy to animate since the orcs are 3D, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Firstly, Iron and Igris were hand-drawn, and secondly, they had to hand-draw a bunch of 2D effects. In this shot, for example, the orcs were 3D, but they switched to 2D following the impact frames. This was of course accompanied by tons of hand-drawn blurred effects. Basically, they could make the orcs 3D, but animating them taking damage whilst using CGI was probably a bit too complicated, so they switched over to 2D for that stuff. This was one of the cooler action sequences from this episode. Most of the movement existed in the form of smears and effects, but it was fun to look at. Another one of those volumetric foreshortened shots here. Sung's legs look a lot longer compared to the rest of his body due to implied camera proximity, and the timing looked a bit Kanada-esque, so it was probably corrected by Takafumi Tori. The orcs were 3D in this shot, but if you pay attention, you'll notice that their models don't take any damage. 2D blur simply appears on top of them. Not a fan of how choppy this part is, by the way. Sung's body turning was way too jumpy. It needed an extra frame or two. A lot of these shots were volumetric. You could see the scope of the environment. The shots showed the enormity of the throne room, and we can thank Kikuchi's storyboards for that. They were so three-dimensional, the shots didn't feel congested. This cut looked amazing. The shading on Sung switched to 4 tones as the glow from the flames appeared, and the effects looked nice. I'll probably end up setting a world record for the most uses of the word dynamic by the time I'm done with this episode, because look at this sequence. The camera zooms in, followed by a partial rotation around the smoke cloud. Also, the smoke itself was slightly textured and looked nice. Speaking of smoke, this cut featured tons of relatively detailed smoke. In fact, this entire section consisted of a large amount of effects, whether it's the debris, the smoke, or the fire. I will skip over those non-action scenes they threw in because they didn't have much going on in terms of animation, but I will praise this shot. The layout looks really volumetric. We then get to what is probably the animation highlight from this episode, and guess who animated it? That's right, Yoshihiro Kanno. Also yes, this entire thing is one single cut. It's over 27 seconds long, and that alone is mind-blowing. Kanno is a master of action animation and effects, and timing and practically everything else, but those things in particular. The scene starts with this really well animated exchange of strikes. The characters have a large amount of detail, which makes the smooth animation so much more impressive. These thick smeary lines looked amazing as well. Kanno's grasp over timing is unmatched. The fast action is buffered perfectly by this well-drawn slow motion shot. Also, there is a bit of blur thrown in, presumably to hide any potential potential inconsistencies in the drawing. This cut was really dynamic by the way because, of course, the scene here switches from an ultra-wide angle side profile to an ultra-wide high-angle shot. Of course, the characters were moving the entire time. The scene then went classic Kano, with the choppier timing, the fast-paced, energetic exchange of strikes, and these high-energy flickering wind effects. Of course, the camera was going nuts throughout all of this. This impact frame sequence near the end was excellent, obviously, but I'll be honest, it didn't exactly feel deserved. I don't think the movement that preceded it needed all that impact. The action simply consisted of this bear swiping down. A movement that simple didn't need impact frames this grandiose. But hey, it looks good, and at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Really cool bit of character acting here. The snappy timing looks amazing. We got some more of that 3D background aided camera work, including this partial rotation. The animation here is so fluid and volumetric that the ice thing ends up melting a fair bit, which is fitting. You know, ice melting, really cool looking effects here, and the compositing around them was amazing as well. The colors really pop out. And speaking of colors popping out, this close-up was phenomenal. The spiky jagged effects looked incredible and the drawing quality was very high. Yes, the animation near the end was looped, but it looked amazing regardless. This explosion was another example of those volumetric ultra-wide shots I talked about. Storyboard artist Kikuchi used every opportunity he got to highlight the scale of the throne room. Speaking of which, really loved the scaling here. Also, the slow motion looks really cool. Again, for the millionth time, Kikuchi is so good at storyboarding. We got a large amount of well-drawn effects around this section. The smoke looked amazing and the fire was really well drawn and composited. The photography team darkened some of these shots to give them a backlit look. They also added this wobbly heatwave effect. These additions really helped sell the heat. Also, these monster drawings were absolutely phenomenal. Look at the fabric animations, so good. We then got to the second major animation highlight from this episode, and this one was almost certainly animated by Takafumi Tori. The timing and the effect shapes make that obvious. We got this incredibly snappy exaggerated cut. The perspective work was insane. This was actually the third shot of this kind from this episode, so I guess Kikuchi loves this particular composition. Also loved the reflection on the dagger. It was such a cool addition. Like I said, the perspectives were exaggerated and the timing, complete with these Kanada's kinetic lines, was incredible. The monster drawings, as you'd expect, looked amazing, and we got more 3D aided camera work. I will say this, the background during this section looked too busy, and that, coupled with the erratic animation, made the shot difficult to follow. Very strong drawings though, and those thick sparks were classic Tori, although this zoom in could have used an extra frame or two. The final bit of action, as you'd expect, was incredibly dynamic. We got more of that camera work. This low angle shot looked amazing, and the camera wrapping around the orc looked so good. This shot in particular was great. The hypothetical camera was fixed and movement was conveyed through the relative motion of the background. If all of that wasn't insane enough, they threw in some decent hand-to-hand combat near the end. The action here felt energetic and the debris in particular looked amazing. Again, I've said this before, but these characters are not easy to animate. And finally, we got a Hajime Nakagawa sequence. He decided to animate a relatively laid-back scene this time around, surprisingly enough. As per usual, his art style with the distinct shading and the block-like shapes looked amazing. It looks like someone took the 2D characters and crumpled the paper they were drawn on. That's a compliment, by the way, so good. And that was the episode. It looked amazing. It was an ambitious undertaking and the execution was great. Like I said near the start, this was a high priority episode, and normally I wouldn't be surprised if this was the best this season had to offer, but based on what I've heard, there are at least a couple of upcoming episodes worth looking forward to, meaning I'll probably end up making more of these videos. And that should just about do it. Press the like button if you enjoyed, check out this other bit of content on screen, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and until next time.